The sky shattered into a nightmare of whistling arrows and cracking gunfire. Abigail Prescott tasted blood and dust, her cheek stinging where a splinter from the wagon side panel had flown. This god-forsaken plain, vast and unforgiving, was about to become her grave. But even as terror clawed at her throat, her gaze flickered to the man beside her. Her guide, Kai. He hadn't flinched. He remained a study in impossible calm amidst the deadly chaos. His dark eyes, usually placid as a still pool, now held the glint of a drawn hunting knife. This silent enigma, the native tracker she'd hired for his knowledge of forgotten trails, he was about to become the outlaw's most lethal miscalculation. For coiled within that quietude was a storm of hidden fury, and the first drops were about to fall. Abigail was a woman forged in the crucible of necessity. Left a widow with little more than a strong back and a sharper mind, she'd poured every last cent and every ounce of courage into this trading venture. Her wagon, groaning under the weight of precious tools, medicines, and bolts of bright calico, represented her defiant stand against a world that expected women to fade into the background. The destination was Stone Bend, a raw, hopeful settlement clinging to life on the far edge of the territory, a place where her goods could mean the difference between survival and despair for its inhabitants. The route was a serpent's path, through hostile lands, which was why she'd sought out Kai in the sprawling, rough-hewn outpost of Miller's Crossing. The old, one-legged trapper who'd vouched for him had said, "Kai reads the land like a scholar reads a book, and spirits walk with him." His silence had been a constant companion on their journey, unsettling at first, a deep well Abigail couldn't fathom. Days would pass with only guttural affirmations or subtle hand gestures from him. She'd once seen him, near a parched riverbed they'd named Arroyo Seco, pause mid-stride, his head cocked. He'd then led them on a wide detour, offering no explanation. Only later did she spot the telltale tracks of a large grizzly, fresh enough to make her blood run cold, exactly where they would have passed. He hadn't mentioned it, his preternatural awareness simply a part of him, like the air he breathed. She had thought his stillness a sign of detachment, but now, with death riding down upon them, she sensed it was the focused calm of a perfectly honed weapon. Their first brush with the coming storm had been 3 sun-scorched days earlier, at a place the maps called Antelope Wells, though no antelope had been seen there for years. 6 riders, hard men with eyes like chips of flint, were watering their horses. Their leader, a gaunt figure whose face was bisected by a puckered white scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer, was Cyrus Vane. Tales of Vane's brutality were whispered with dread across the territories, of homesteads burned to ash with families still inside, of stagecoaches looted, and their passengers left for the buzzards. Vane's cold obsidian gaze had swept over Abigail, then lingered on her wagon with an unholy possessiveness. He'd said nothing, merely letting a stream of dark tobacco juice fall near the hem of her dusty skirt, a gesture more insulting than any curse. His men, emboldened, had offered lewd catcalls and threats thinly veiled as jests. Abigail, her heart a cold knot in her chest, had kept her expression carefully neutral, her hand instinctively moving closer to the greener shotgun by her seat. Kai, astride his wiry pony, had seemed to pay them no mind, his attention apparently fixed on a distant butte. Yet, Abigail had noted the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders, the way his fingers tightened on his pony's reins. He'd led them away without a backward glance, but that night he'd chosen a campsite nestled deep within a cluster of granite boulders, a natural fortress, and his usual quiet vigilance had intensified into an almost palpable aura of alertness. The prairie itself seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. A profound sense of being stalked settled over Abigail, a constant, invisible pressure that frayed her nerves. She found herself jumping at the snap of a twig, the sudden cry of a hawk. 2 dawns passed. Kai had silently dismounted, his gaze fixed on the dew-kissed grass. He'd picked up a single, almost invisible strand of dark horsehair, snagged on a low bush, then pointed to a scuffed patch of earth where a shod hoof had recently pressed. "They scout ahead," he'd murmured, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves, "then fall back. They know our pace." Later that same day, as they navigated a narrow cut between 2 mesas, He'd suddenly pulled his pony to a halt, his head tilted, listening to something Abigail couldn't hear. He held up a hand, and she'd reined in her team, her heart thudding. Minutes stretched into an eternity, filled only with the hum of insects and the distant sigh of the wind. Then, from the ridge above, a small pebble dislodged, clattering down the rock face. It was a tiny sound, easily missed, but Kai's eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly. He'd said nothing, but after they'd cleared the pass, he'd led them on a new, more arduous path, away from the easier trail. Abigail felt a growing dread. "How many, Kai?" She'd finally asked that evening, her voice tight. He'd looked into the fire, then met her gaze. "Enough," was his only reply. But the single word carried the weight of an oncoming avalanche. His quiet observation was a shield, she began to understand. But it was also a constant reminder of the danger that drew ever closer. The ambush exploded with the ferocity of a prairie thunderstorm. They were caught in the open, a vast, sun-bleached expanse offering no cover, when the first volley of shots ripped through the air. Lead balls whined like angry hornets, one punching a hole through a water barrel with a sickening thud. From behind a series of low dunes, at least 15 riders erupted, their war cries splitting the air, Cyrus Vane at their head, his scarred face alight with cruel anticipation. Abigail's hands flew to her rifle, the cold steel a small reassurance against the terror threatening to overwhelm her. She sighted down the barrel, fired, saw a horse stumble, then reloaded with frantic haste. Beside her, Kai seemed to transform. The placid guide was gone. In his place was a figure of coiled intensity. He'd already loosed 2 arrows from his short, powerful bow before Abigail had fired her second shot. Each arrow was a whisper of death, finding its mark with chilling precision. One outlaw screamed and clutched his chest, toppling from his charging horse. But Vane's men were numerous, hardened by violence, and they pressed their attack relentlessly. 2 riders, their faces contorted with malice, broke from the pack, their eyes fixed on Abigail, intent on cutting her down. One of them, a mountain of a man with a matted beard and a glinting axe tied to his saddle, bore down on her, his evil grin mirroring the one from the thumbnail. "Your time's up, Miss Traitor," he roared, his voice swallowed by another crack of gunfire near her head. The wagon bucked as a wheel was hit, threatening to send them sprawling. Despair, cold and absolute, began to grip Abigail's soul. This was it. Then, in the space of a heartbeat, the world shifted. As Vane, his scarred lips peeled back in a triumphant snarl, spurred his horse forward for the kill, Kai erupted. He didn't just move, he exploded into action. With a grace that defied the ruggedness of his appearance, he launched himself from his pony, landing not with a thud, but with the silent agility of a hunting cat. The simple bow vanished, replaced as if by magic with a gleaming tomahawk in one hand and a long, bone-handled knife in the other. His dark eyes, moments before watchful, now blazed with an ancient, terrifying fire. A single, sharp cry tore from his throat, not a word Abigail knew, but a sound that spoke of generations of warriors, a primal challenge that sliced through the bandits' exultant yells and struck a chord of pure fear in their hearts. His entire demeanor had changed. He was no longer the quiet tracker, but a spirit of vengeance unleashed upon the plains. Vane himself pulled his horse up short, his expression of triumph wiped away, replaced by stunned disbelief. His men, who had been riding with the arrogance of predators, hesitated, their momentum broken by this sudden, shocking transformation. Kai was a blur of motion, a whirlwind of lethal intent. He met the first charging outlaw not with defense, but with a devastatingly swift attack, his tomahawk a silver flash in the sunlight. The man went down without a sound. Before the second could react, Kai was upon him, the knife a whisper of steel that found its mark. He moved with a ferocity that was both breathtaking and horrifying, using the chaos to his advantage, turning the outlaws' numbers against them. He was not merely fighting for survival, he was dispensing justice with every calculated, deadly strike. Abigail could only stare, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a profound, disbelieving awe. The quiet man, the enigma, was a warrior of terrible, beautiful skill. The brutal dance of combat shifted in an instant. Kai was the eye of the storm, a force of controlled destruction. He weaved through the frantic, disorganized outlaws, his tomahawk and knife rising and falling with deadly purpose. An outlaw who lunged with a bowie knife found his wrist seized in a grip of iron, a sharp twist, a sickening crack, and the man reeled back, his weapon clattering to the dust, his face a mask of agony. Another, trying to draw a bead on Kai with a pepperbox pistol, suddenly found the warrior too close, the tomahawk cleaving through the air where his head had been a second before, forcing a panicked retreat. The hulking outlaw with the axe, who had been so confident in his pursuit of Abigail, now found himself the hunted. He swung his axe in a wild, desperate arc, but Kai ducked beneath it with fluid ease, his knife darting out like a serpent's tongue. The big man gasped, his eyes wide with shock, then slowly crumpled to the ground, his menace extinguished. Seeing Kai's incredible prowess, witnessing the impossible become real, Abigail felt a surge of desperate courage. Her hands, slick with sweat, firmed their grip on her rifle. She took careful aim at an outlaw, drawing a bead on Kai's exposed side, and fired. The outlaw shrieked and clutched his arm, his shot going wild. Cyrus Vane, his face a contorted mask of rage and disbelief, screamed, "He's alone! Take him down, you curs!" But his men's bravado had shattered. They saw not one man, but a vengeful spirit of the plains. Vane, consumed by fury and a dawning fear, charged Kai himself, his heavy dragoon revolver barking flame. Kai moved like smoke, the bullets tearing through the air he'd occupied moments before. As Vane's horse thundered past, Kai pivoted, his body low, and with an explosive burst of strength, he launched himself at the outlaw leader. He caught Vane around the waist, dragging the heavier man from his saddle. They crashed to the earth in a brutal tangle of limbs. Vane, snarling, fought like a cornered wolf, his fists and boots lashing out, but Kai was a whirlwind of focused power. There was a brief, desperate struggle, the grunts of exertion, the thud of blows, then a choked cry from Vane. Kai rose, his chest heaving, the bloody knife in his hand. Cyrus Vane lay on the prairie floor, clutching a gushing wound in his shoulder, his face pale with pain and utter defeat. His reign of terror was over. The remaining few outlaws, witnessing their leaders fall, turned tail and fled, their panicked retreat a stark contrast to their earlier aggression, disappearing into the vastness from which they came. An almost deafening silence descended upon the bloodied grass, broken only by the whimpering of Vane and the ragged gasps of Abigail and Kai. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Several of Vane's men lay still, stark figures against the indifferent prairie. Others had simply vanished, swallowed by the horizon. Kai, his movements economical even in the aftermath of such violent exertion, wiped his knife on a clump of grass, his expression unreadable, though the fire in his eyes had banked to smoldering coals. He walked over to the groaning Cyrus Vane, not with malice, but with a weary finality. He tore a strip of cloth from Vane's own shirt and roughly bound the outlaw's bleeding shoulder. "Your power here is ended," Kai said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the weight of judgment. He took Vane's gun belt, leaving the man disarmed, humiliated, and on foot in the heart of a wilderness that showed no mercy to the weak. Abigail slowly approached, her rifle held loosely in her trembling hands. "Kai," she breathed, the name a question, an expression of awe, of gratitude too profound for words. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw not just the warrior, nor just the guide, but the man, weary from battle but resolute. "We are safe," he said simply. They worked together to assess the damage to the wagon, their earlier dynamic subtly, irrevocably altered. The bullet-riddled wheel was secured, the fallen goods reloaded. As they prepared to move on, Abigail knew their journey to Stonebend would be different. The silence between them now held a new depth, a shared understanding forged in the heat of battle. She no longer saw a quiet, perhaps indifferent, tracker. She saw a guardian, a man of immense courage and skill, whose depths she had only begun to comprehend. The vast, untamed plains, she reflected, held countless secrets, but the greatest, Most astonishing secret she had encountered was the quiet strength, the hidden fire within her native guide. His legend and hers would travel with the wind.